Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to Al Monitor's flagship podcast on the Middle East. My name is Amran Zaman, and today I'll be discussing the human toll of the Iran war. There is endless punditry about President Donald Trump's next move and how Iran's regime will respond. Escalation ladders, the Strait of Hormuz, these are the common themes which dominate the conversation. But what of the human cost, especially to the people of Iran? Iran's Deputy Health Minister Ali Jafarian said that as of March 26th, at least 1,937 people had died. 240 of them were women and 212 were children. It's almost impossible to verify the figures. There is an internet blackout across much of Iran. Amid the fog of war, though, one organization has been doing a remarkable job of getting information out. It's called Human Rights Activists in Iran, and it's widely regarded as impartial, credible, and thorough. It provided one of the most exhaustive assessments of the Iranian regime's brutal crackdown on protesters in January, and now it's documenting the impact of the war. I spoke to Skylar Thompson, who is Deputy Director of Human Rights Activists in Iran. Welcome to our program, Skylar. It's so good to have you with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're doing extremely important work at this very difficult time. My first question to you, Skylar, is how do you actually manage to gather any information given that there's practically no internet? How do you do it?
Sure. To be honest, there's no straightforward answer to this question. The organization has been working in this field for over 20 years now. And we unfortunately have a wealth of experience in navigating these types of internet and communication shutdowns. Most notably, last year during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, we navigated very, very similar circumstances. And also even more recently in January at this massacre that took place with the internet shutdown. What's changed is the shutdown is becoming more and more sophisticated as time goes on. And that really requires us to evolve with that. And so there are a number of different circumvention tools that we use to stay in touch with our network on the ground. And I think the key here, without, compromising any security, is just to emphasize that as the sophistication with these shutdowns and internal communication channels gets more and more tight, we have to evolve with that. So we rely on a number of different circumvention tools in order to stay in touch with our network. And it's not just for times of conflict, right? This is something that we have to do even in peacetime, when though sometimes communication can be higher, the security risk is still there. And so these types of tools are still incredibly important.
Well, obviously, because you did that very, very important report on the protests in January, the absolute horrors that were inflicted on civilians by the regime. But now, today, we would like to focus mainly on civilian casualties of this war. So what is the exact death toll as of today that you can confirm based on your sources?
Sure. So as of today, we have confirmed at least 1,464 civilian deaths, which I have to say, I think to some it might sound like, okay, that's not that many. Look at the extent to which the targeting is taking place. The US is saying we've hit 8,000 plus targets. In Israel, the same thing. But it's not the case. This is a very unprecedented level of harm that we're seeing. I was speaking to a colleague at the organization Air Wars yesterday, and we were sort of comparing numbers. You know, the deadliest day of attacks that we have so far in Iran happened on March 9th, where we saw at least 250 individuals killed. This is more than the total number of casualties that we saw during last year's 52-day campaign in Yemen. And that was already a campaign that was of unprecedented harm. So it sort of sets the stage for what we're seeing here.
And of those, I believe quite a few are children, at least according to the Iranian Red Crescent.
Yes, so we have confirmed at least 217 of that number are children, and most of those are also under the age of 10. So this is absolutely gruesome when you think about, the percentage of individuals that have been killed is nearly 15% children.
And of course, they don't have the same kind of infrastructure as in Israel, where people can, go to shelters and that sort of thing. So obviously, I'm sure that makes everything that much worse.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
What I have noticed, and correct me if I am wrong, is that the regime does not seem terribly keen on advertising these casualty figures. At least I've hit something of a wall when I've tried to reach out to people who I know are linked to the regime, or directly, Iranian diplomats, saying, look, I would like to talk about this, the human cost of this war, and have had no response. Do you have a similar problem, and why do you think this is?
Wonderful question. I believe, if I could take a step back just for a moment to the beginning of your question, you hit on something really important here, and that's that Iranians are facing a campaign of unprecedented harm with no sort of infrastructure set up to protect them from that harm. And there are a lot of things happening with that. Even if you go a step back, Iranians aren't privy to these so-called warnings that are coming from the United States and Israel. It is their obligation to provide advance warnings, particularly when targeting is happening in the most densely populated area of the country. We are talking about a city the size of New York, and these sort of targets are happening throughout the city. And what we're seeing is a rather alarming pattern of warnings, advance warnings, taking place on social media channels. This is not something we've really registered before in conflict. We're seeing it happen from both the IDF and also the CENTCOM account, these two Farsi accounts that work in tandem to show that advance warnings are taking place. But there are a number of problems with that. One of the key problems is that, X is banned domestically in Iran. And even when Iranians have access to this platform, they're needing to use VPNs to do so. And then if you take away both of those layers, we're talking about, 15% of the population able to access the platform. I don't think that grandma is getting on X and checking if warnings are coming. So this is really problematic. And then if you get to the warnings themselves, they contradict each other. If we go back to day one, the sort of general warning that came from CENTCOM was shelter in place, don't leave your homes. This is what they're calling a warning. I'm not sure that warning really complies with the laws of armed conflict, but it's what they are doing. And then the IDF the same day is issuing specific evacuation orders from some areas. So we have one side saying to stay in place and one side saying to evacuate, and that is really problematic. And this is also compounded by warnings. I'm sure many of your listeners may have seen warnings from the IDF that are also disseminating old maps of the city. So telling people to evacuate an area when this is not even, updated information, which also leads you to wonder what's going on in terms of the targeting calculation. Is this happening with outdated intelligence, with outdated information? Are we relying on artificial intelligence without strict human oversight? Lots of things coming into play. And then that brings me to your, ultimate question of, Iran and Iran's obligations, and also why are they not issuing the sort of numbers? And I would say there are a lot of things happening here. One thing is that, okay, we're not seeing the warnings happening from the US and Israel, but Iran also has an obligation under the laws of armed conflict to protect their civilian population. And one of the key ways that they're not upholding that is by shutting off the internet, not allowing people to communicate with each other, increasing security related arrests. We've seen over 1,800 security related arrests related to this conflict since the 28th of February, which is an incredibly high number and comes with a compounded concern of what happens to these individuals, because we know that security related arrests carry a very, very high consequence, sometimes even can lead to the death penalty. And so Iran is, not protecting civilians in this way, but then we don't have air raid sirens, we don't have shelters, we don't have these sort of infrastructures set up that Iran really does have the obligation to provide in communities. So there are so many things happening here that are really creating sort of a cacophony of tragedy. And then you have the narrative control. So narratives are coming from all corners. They're coming from the United States, from Israel, from Iran, and they're all very confusing. And I think that that's very intentional. You have, of course, the desire of Iran to control the narrative. And that's something that's their MO. This is one of the key reasons that they shut down the internet. They don't want a population of 9 million people in the city of Tehran to be able to show what's really happening on the ground, to show that, they're also having to go through checkpoints, which we know are being targeted. And that creates fear in people that are, desiring to flee. And so while Iran is publishing numbers, indeed, there are numbers of deaths coming from, the Iranian Red Crescent, which are then endorsed often by the state. We don't see any transparency, and that is really a trademark of the regime.
Well, it's curious because in the 12-day war, there seemed to be a greater appetite, for the lack of a better word, to advertise the human death toll. And in fact, they had loosened restrictions on foreign journalists, encouraging them to come and visit, Iran and to look at what had happened to ordinary people. Maybe it's, early days and we don't know, their strategy may shift. But in all of this, I find it so troubling that the focus, this is a criticism I direct at myself and my fellow journalists, is it's all about geopolitics. And we really don't hear very much about the human toll, the stories of ordinary Iranians who have been, affected.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I mean, while the geopolitical situation is incredibly important, we know that, regional spillover is a risk. We're seeing what's going on in southern Lebanon. There are all types of things that are of great concern. But we do tend, and this is not, unfortunately, unique to the current conflict. When it comes to Iran, we do tend to focus on all of the geopolitics around it and sort of glaze over the human tragedy that's happening on the ground. Iranians are crying out for people to hear them and to listen to them. And it seems that often we don't hear those voices. And so I really enjoy the place where I sit, where I'm, able to communicate with Iranians inside the country, understand that there's nuance, because something else that's happening in Western media is, we tend to hear one side of the story, but we're talking about a place with, decades and decades of history that makes all of these opinions very, very nuanced. People at the beginning often were more supportive of this war. They were dying for change, and the idea that we're going to target specific people that may lead to that change was quite welcome. But as we go on and we see all of the destruction that's happening, the lives that are lost, and going beyond the lives that have been lost, we're looking at an extensive amount of damage on civilian infrastructure that will have reverberating effects for decades. I mean, it's just fact. And I think that people are starting to become a bit, sick and tired of seeing their country damaged to the level that it has gotten to.
Well, obviously, that's a strategic decision, though, to make life unbearable for their citizens. I guess hoping that this will lead them to revolt somehow. But setting aside the damage to critical infrastructure, which of course is so very important, also to cultural monuments, which, the Iranian people take such immense pride in, as Vali Nasser pointed out in an interview, I think, with Bloomberg. That too is kind of changing people's attitudes towards this intervention. Is that something that you encounter, though obviously you're doing frontline work that's maybe not focusing too much on that?
I think that this is a crucial point. I'm not sure how familiar you are, but there are these videos that circulate on social media of Iranians in the diaspora sort of creating content that shows the beauty of their country and saying, this is the real Iran. I want to return to this Iran one day. And many of the cultural sites that have been targeted are those sites that we see included in these videos. The Golistan Palace, which is a beautiful, magnificent piece of Persian identity, destroyed is really tragic. And so I think there's incredible merit to that. And, going beyond the emotional and the sort of human reaction to those things, these are also, again, things that are violations of the laws of armed conflict. These must be protected at all extents.
And one final note, Skylar, because I know how pressed for time you are. It's also, to me, very strange how little attention is being paid to the fact that this war began during the holy month of Ramadan, and that didn't even seem to resonate much in the Islamic world, in their media, which again, maybe this is too much of a leap, but perhaps the fact that Iran is Shia. And for some Sunnis, I know this for a fact, being one myself, they're kind of not real Muslims. I mean, all of this sort of seems to be in the mix as well, maybe detracting from our sensibility as human beings for fellow human beings. Skylar, thank you so much for joining us here today, and we very much hope to have you back.
Thank you so much, Amber, and it was a pleasure.
Well, this brings us to the end of this week's episode of On the Middle East. For more coverage of the war on Iran, please go to our website www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.